Well, good morning. Good morning. Today we're talking about the four pillars of self mastery. The reason I'm doing this is because the as we get older, so my model is designed for people over 50 years old. And as we get older, we've been living by habit for so long. I like to say that by around age 35, 95% of everything we do is done by habit. And that's shown out in research. That has been around unchallenged for decades. And it seems to get harder to change those habits as people get older. And it makes sense because by the time you're 35, you've kind of set into that set of ways. It becomes your personality. And what people attempt to do is change their personality, but the personality is an aggregate of the habits, which makes it difficult and actually impossible because you're trying to change a statistical view of all your habits. So if you take all your habits over time and you have a statistic that creates a statistical view, and now you're trying to change that statistical view from the statistic. You can't do it that way. You change it from the habits up. And it's related to the fact that people think habits are in the mind. And as you've heard my content, the habits live in the network of neurons, and it's all about associations. So the habits have to be trained over time. It has to be conditioned over time, the same way they were conditioned originally. Now, if you go back to the hunter-gatherer times, it makes sense that 0 to 7 age time is so important, and those habits get locked in because it's survival. But as a hunter-gatherer 10, 20,000 years ago, people weren't living much past 35, so it probably didn't present a problem. Today, roughly 500 years ago, it was much more like the hunter-gatherer time than it is today. We have so many more inventions, etc., and capabilities than we did 500 years ago. And so we are not equipped from the hunter-gatherer set of conditioning to function today with the same ease that we with emotional intelligence. And hold on. Emotional intelligence is a powerful set of pillars. Those are the four pillars there: self awareness, self management, social awareness, and relationship management. That's aligned with dynamic leadership. I go further with dynamic leadership because, as the name says, it's dynamic. It can be used in a variety of settings, whether it's project, operational, startup, large corporations, smaller. I do focus on businesses less than 400 people just because the CEO tends to have more say in what goes on. As you get larger and larger, the board becomes more powerful with respect to what goes on day to day. And dynamic leadership does require a different view of things. Doesn't mean it doesn't work in larger organizations. By the time a person, and it doesn't happen at 50. Obviously, it's more of a rheostat, more like a dimmer switch, not a light switch. But what happens is habits get formed or categorized into three groups. They're behavioral habits, and most people think about habits as behavioral habits: scrolling on social media, late snacking, eating the wrong foods, and they have gotten to the point where they can adjust that when things get the pressure gets too big, or when they get too far outside of what they want. They make an adjustment, and those habits, while they may not be able to change them, they are changeable, but while the person may not be able to stop the habit, they are able to regulate it. They're able to stop scrolling on social media when a customer shows up. They're able to stop scrolling on social media when a phone call comes in. So it's the tendency would be to change it at the reaction stage after it's happened, which is again almost impossible because the habits are happening at the association level, 11 million bits per second. By the time it's executed as a response and people letting that response equal the reaction, it's too late. You can't stop it there. That's my 7 phases of habit change, which I talk about. And then the last category is identity or personality. Very few people would think of their personality as their collection of habits, and that's what I was just referring to. Gurus will tell you that if you have a big quest, if you're going to 10x something, the first thing you want to do is create the identity that's aligned with that quest. But if people don't understand how to change the identity, or said a different way, if people don't understand that changing the identity requires changing the collection of habits, right? Because identity is something that happens over a period of time. It's the collective set of habits and actions that happen over time, as is personality. So you don't change it from the personality side. You don't change it from the identity side. You change it through the habits. And that's why I'm breaking out self mastery, because in order to execute on emotional intelligence and for dynamic leadership to work for you and for your people in your organization, you're going to have to first master self. So I have 4 pillars of self mastery. First pillar is knowledge. And I've often said that to know and not do is not much better than not knowing. So there are many people who stop at knowledge. Or I shouldn't say stop at knowledge, but they focus on getting more knowledge. When I learn that thing, when I get that thing. And there are organizations, especially government organizations, some of your larger institutional type organizations, they do reward that view. You don't get promoted unless you have a master's degree. You don't get promoted to this level unless you have a doctorate degree. And I'm not knocking education at all. I think it's important. But what people should be focused on is doing something with that knowledge. So knowledge, it's making sense of the orientation. So you have knowledge is making sense and orienting around the reality, what's true, what matters, and what actually causes results. So now this is where, if you look at my work, 7 performance areas, those go into that category of knowledge. You have to understand it. So I talk about neuroplasticity, I talk about beliefs, and within the 7 performance areas, I'm focusing on mental, physical, spiritual, emotional first, getting a handle on that. But that's knowledge. But without that knowledge and without the common language, it makes this next part of that work more difficult, which is why I focus on the 7 performance areas. And I do laps around it because we start small, we start easy, and then we build and build and build because we want to make it automatic. So we move from knowledge to action to automaticity. So some key distinctions: insights without action has no value, right? To know and not do is like not knowing, as I said. People often live inside convenient versions of the truth rather than principles. That's getting to be worse and worse. I'm seeing that people are choosing narratives that fit. And it's a slippery slope, because I'll also say that if you have a choice of this belief or that belief, why would you have the belief that's not empowering? It makes sense to have the belief that's more empowering. Well, as you go further and further away from that center, you're doing exactly what I was just talking about, right? You're picking convenient versions of the truth, which is not what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I am suggesting is that you focus on principles. Your truth should be based on principles, backed up by principles. And there's principles and near principles. But if it's not happening every single time or almost every single time, and there's going to be exceptions, but exceptions prove the rule, then it's probably not a principle. And if you focus on principles, the world will conform around you, because principles are principles. It's like gravity. Now, we're not talking about intelligence. We're not talking about information or using information as power. It's not positive thinking, not motivation. It's just understanding what the truths are and what really works. So for example, in the context of habits, people have started talking about manifestation and well, I say started. The law of attraction came about in the late 1800s, but you hear more and more people talking about manifestation in this context of how do we get our behavior to be what it is. And it's taken on this look of the external. It's like the outcomes. But if you think about manifesting the way it's talked about, it's this universe thing out there outside of us, and that's what I'm against. So my 7 performance series is all about what we control. There's no woo woo, no mystical mumbo jumbo. Everything I talk about is something that we can control. I'm not saying that there isn't some other dimension, but I'm not focusing on that because in a business setting, we have to be focused on what we can control. Man. Let me just pull up something. Yeah, the wrong slide was queued up, so I'm just pulling up the correct slide. And so the next pillar is habit mastery. I go to habit mastery because understanding how habits are formed, how we create them, how we change them, how they function in our lives, that's all very important. And I would say essential. But knowing, again, back to knowledge, right? Knowing how habits form is not enough. We have to be able to execute on changing it. So the thing about habits is that it happens so fast. My 7 phases of the 1 second habit model is that you literally are the habit goes from beginning to end in sometimes just over half a second. Now, this happens 33,000 times a day, according to research that says we make 33,000 decisions a day. Obviously, there's going to be a bell curve. Those decisions, if you consider that 95% of everything we do is done by habit, those decisions are stimulus response cycles for the most part. Let's call it 31,000 of them, stimulus response cycles. And so habits are happening so quickly, you can't change it after the fact. You can't change it once it's kicked off. This is why reactive habits, once you're already reacting, it's too late. You have to catch it before that. And identity and personality habits don't get changed at the aggregate. You have to change them individually. So understanding that is part of it. And what we do is go through the step-by-step process so the person experiences it. This is not about just, okay, I see that. They have to experience it and see it. And it may take some iterations. One of the challenges I think happens is people have bent themselves into pretzels trying to make sense of all the literature out there compared to their own experience. I've heard people say, oh, the subconscious mind is the higher self. The subconscious mind thinks in pictures, which is true. People go down the path of the amygdala. And it's all this language that has like insulated them from the real understanding. The real understanding is that habits are associations. They live in the network of neurons. To change a habit, you have to change the associations, change the patterns, create new associations. And by the way, it's much easier to layer on a new habit than to change an old one because we have 100 billion neurons, trillions of connections because each neuron is connected to anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. So understanding how that works and then experiencing it and learning how to apply deep practice to live into a new habit is what we're talking about. So you can see I have conditioning and automaticity. What runs by default under pressure? That's the second part of it, is that people can have alignment between their response and their design when everything is fine. I like to say on a good day of a good week. On a bad day of a good week, they might even be able to pull it off. But on a bad day of a bad week, see, that's where we need this ability. We need to be able to execute on a bad day of a bad week every single time. And that requires deep practice. It requires habitual patterns. It requires deep practice. Now, just like a sports team or an athlete, every single day is not going to be your absolute best. You have to be at your best what's available on any given day. So we're not talking about willpower, certainly not talking about discipline. As a matter of fact, willpower and discipline wane throughout the day. And they also wane with the amount of decisions we make, and they wane with use, and they wane with stress. So we have to be able to make changes without relying on them. And there's another problem that comes in with willpower, is that it triggers the I don't want power. So now you're fighting against yourself. And all of this has to be fleshed out. And that's what we do in the habit mastery. That habit mastery pillar is essential, which is why it's second. Because if a person doesn't understand how habits are formed and how they layer on new ones, it makes it more difficult for them to even think that any of this is possible. That's where we get stuck. We think that I can't change my personality because it's what it is. But if you accept that your habits collectively make up your personality, and your personality is an aggregate of a set of conditioning over time, if you can change that conditioning, your personality will change. Same with reaction. You can't change the reaction with logic. You have to change it before you change it at the priming level, at the cognitive bias level, at the heuristic level. And that's why we get into the 7 phases of the 1 second model. Let me just go to the pad and talk about this a bit. So this is the 1 second model. What happens is there is a pre-listening phase, and this pre-listening is this constant awareness of what's going on, what's around me, what's coming up, what's likely to happen. The brain is attempting to predict what it might experience. Again, you go back to hunter-gatherer time. In certain kinds of environments, you're more likely to see a tiger. Other environments, you're more likely to see some other animal. That's just an example of how that would be working. So it's priming you to be looking for something. I shouldn't use the word priming. It's preparing you. Then the next one is your heuristics. This is called a rapid appraisal. And this is about 1/4 of a second. And let's call this 1/10 of a second. This is about 1/4 of a second. This is the reaction time. This is part of the reaction time to the subconscious. And we say the subconscious has a reaction time of about 1/4 of a second. It's not just waiting. It's not that it's slow. It's that it's figuring things out. Cognitive biases, mental heuristics, meta programs, sort of bundling of programs, other heuristics, anything that's, like if you have a phobia, that's definitely in here, right? The phobia happens in that rapid appraisal, and it collapses. This thing can go from that to this. As that phase collapses because of the perceived danger associated with the phobia. Then the next one is assembly and consolidation. This is where the subconscious comes in. So if you said the subconscious has 1/4 of an action reaction time, that's right in here. And now it's taking the heuristics, the cognitive biases. Also, you have your priming in here. Your mindset is in here. All of that feeds into the assembly and consolidation. And now you have what forms as the reaction. And this is why I say if you're trying to fix it on the back end, you're way too late. The reaction is happening before the conscious mind even comes online. Conscious mind has a reaction time of about 1/2 second. So that's 1/4. That's 1/4. And then the reaction time of the conscious mind has a 1/2 second. And this you don't want the reaction to equal the response. But when it collapses, that's exactly what happens. That collapses, this one collapses, and now the conscious mind, this is just building, building, building. And when the conscious mind comes online, the reaction equals the response. R1 reaction equals response R2. And that's what we don't want. After the conscious mind comes online and it receives the transition. So in here is a transition. Because you're going from energy that's pulsing through the neural pathways to something, energy, thought that can be perceived by the conscious mind. So this here is the beginning of the transition, and the conscious mind picks it up. And then you have from there, it's a few more steps, and eventually it leads to a response. But this is an important area right here, because if you don't transfer it to thought, it's there, just the reaction automatically goes into the response. And this is where you see somebody who's triggered. They're not even, you can't speak to them rationally. They just, it's like escalating. You see this on videos. You can watch them. You can watch people in high stress situations, and you can see they're not in touch with who they are. They're just reacting out of some set of associations. So this is the 7 phases of the 1 second model. And by the time you're done here, by the time it hands off to the conscious mind, you have that 1 second. It's actually under a second. So that's the habit module or pillar. And the next one that we have is state. We have state management. So that pre-listening and the priming and all that has a lot to do with your state. So in my 7-step reset, I introduced that step 2, which is your state, checking in and making sure your state is right. I call this state mastery, mindfulness, present moment. We want to be calm. We want to be calm, ready, adaptive, not biased towards threat. So we change the bias of the subconscious so it's not geared towards assuming everything is a threat. We make it so that it's more neutral, so you're less likely to get triggered into fear mode, because we don't want fight or flight. What we want is focus and engage. So in that 1 second model, we are shifting from fight or flight to focus and engage. And part of that starts with state mastery. So you can see I first covered the habit. So knowledge is understanding. Then we went to habit mastery. And now the third pillar, and I do these in order, is state mastery. You have to understand how to get back to a productive state that's aligned with your vision. And this is calm. It's the power of now. It's related to that. It's flow. And what's going to happen by default is that you should see fewer and fewer decisions that you're making. So if you take the 33,000 decisions per day and you take 65,000 seconds that we're awake on average per day, you're saying at every other second we have one of these stimulus response cycles. As you stop paying attention to every stimuli that comes across, that number is going to be reduced. And then as you disregard some that you notice, so something comes in, but you recognize it's not a threat, you just disregard it. You don't have to complete that stimulus response cycle. It gets stopped inside that 1 second model. So this is an important one, because we've got to get to the state. So this is where meditation comes in. This is where rituals come in. And I advocate setting your tone for the day every day so that you're priming yourself. You're being primed all the time. Advertising is priming you. Their marketers and advertisers get paid big bucks to get you to buy things that you wouldn't otherwise buy. So we have to make sure that we're priming ourselves and making our internal priming larger and greater than the external stimuli that are going to come. So our inner vision, our inner world, our inner model has to be greater. Our inner priming has to be greater than the external. And as you do that, you'll be able to disregard some of those as they come in. So state drives response more than circumstance. If you put a person in a certain state, the same exact stimulus, instead of being neutral, could be threat and into fight or flight. Depending on your state, the meaning of a given stimulus would be different. So calm and centered is a condition that can be restored instantly, right? Because the 7-step reset, step 7 is returning to mindfulness, and you come back to step 1, which is your being, and step 2, which is your state. So that 712 gets you back to being in that state. The state that's going to be productive for whatever comes your way. Now, this one here, people know what to do, but lose access to it in the moment. Reactions will almost always override intention. We do a thing called implementation intentions, but you have to have a handle on those reactions, or you're just going to be lost. You can't keep up with the 11 million bits per second when you're dealing with a conscious mind that's 50 bits per second. And the reason that's significant is when that handoff happens, when the transfer goes from neural pathway signals to the conscious mind, to thought, something that can be perceived by the conscious mind. Remember, you're going from 11 million bits per second over here to 50 bits per second. So the conscious mind, sorry. So the conscious mind just can't keep up. And again, that's why we go into the habit part first, then we do the habit mastery. And this one, the next one, is one that you don't usually see me talking about. And that is forgiveness. So why is forgiveness in here? Well, people will, like I said, they roll things up. They see the personality. They see that they're reactive. They don't like the behavior, but they also know that they can't change it. They also may be trapped and feel like they don't want to forgive. They may feel like the affront is so significant that they can't possibly forgive. Or they may have associated that forgiveness means I'm going to continue to be abused or whatever, or taken advantage of. So you get this forgiveness versus forgetting. And I'll say it like this: you can forgive, you don't have to forget. But at the same time, you don't want to be bringing it up every single time. And there is another level to this, and that's setting boundaries. So you can forgive and set boundaries. Now, I'm not going to say every time there's an affront, set a new boundary. I like to use the rule of 3. If it happens one time, I pay attention to it, I note it. Happens a second time, I'm now aware and I'm starting to think what I'm going to do. I maybe create my implementation intention, so I'm doing it with a clear mind. If it happens a third time, I'm setting a boundary. Now, even the boundary can be done. It could be 100% me. The boundary could be, I'm driving my car to this location. I'm not staying at their home. I'm staying in a hotel. Or maybe the only kind of event I'm going to with this person is when there's other people around. Whatever that boundary is, you're setting that boundary on yourself. Now, there's levels. You could also set a boundary with them. There's a thing called nonviolent communication, where you make a request of someone in a nonviolent way, in a way that doesn't trigger them. And you're making that request where you're setting boundaries. If they don't honor that boundary, then your next step is not to maybe engage with them. The point is, if you don't forgive yourself, you're going to constantly ding yourself on your self-image, because there's an open wound there. You've got to get that wound resolved. And it's not about covering it up. It's not about suppressing it. It's about getting it resolved so it doesn't create energy anymore. But you also have to forgive other people, because if you don't forgive them, that's another wound. And remember, habits are association. So when we go through the first steps, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, let's do this. So we go through the first steps, mental, and then we have on top of that, physical, spiritual, emotional. So this is the part that's in our control. This is the foundation. We control this part. And we have to get that right. If we don't get that right, it's going to be difficult to move into working with other people, and relationships are necessary for your professional goals. And the problem here that people don't think about is if you have open wounds, if you haven't forgiven people, you haven't forgiven yourself, you don't know what's going to come up that's going to trigger that association to that wound. And now, and I'm not talking mental health. None of this is mental health. I'm just talking about managing through emotional intelligence for a productive, high performance environment. We have to get those wounds resolved. So no matter what happens, they're not getting triggered. This is where somebody is like, everything is fine. And all of a sudden this person's going winky dink and you don't know why. And they're blaming you for stuff and you didn't do anything, right? It's that angst, that pain that came from years ago just got triggered, and neurons that fire together wire together. And they also, the ones that wire together, start firing together. So now you have these neurons. They've been dormant, but they can activate in an instant if it comes down to life or death. And if that wound is big enough, that could be seen as life and death. And even though it's not, and even though it's not even related to this person you have. So you want to get that closed out. So I do talk a lot about we're in control, and then emotional is the gateway to the right side or to the top, which is relationship, professional, and financial. These are the 7 performance areas. However, because the relationship, professional, and financial involve other people, we have to do things on purpose to get that resolved. And one of them is solving the associations. And this is why the forgiveness is last, because we have we have to believe that we can change our habits, and we have to believe that we can set boundaries, and we have to believe that we have agency. So we have to make sure that we know that we're not going to drop off into one of these anxiety spirals. And by the way, I like to think of financial not so much as financial, because that's just one way of measure. It's really your outcome. And that outcome is a result of what you've done with relationships and professional. And financial could be a lifestyle. There's different ways of looking at it. So back to the slide, forgiveness, resolution, and integration, clearing emotional residue so the past doesn't hijack the present. And in my emotional modulation work, one of the things we talk about is you have to make sure that you know that you can modulate your emotions no matter how much chaos and angst is going on around you. Because if you don't do that, there's this thing in your mind, this fear that you could go into an anxiety spiral. And an anxiety spiral can wipe out all the work that you've done. So forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I kind of said that. Forgiveness does not mean allowing abuse. Boundaries and forgiveness can coexist. And I do recommend having a series of boundaries that you can apply. And when you go into the forgiveness, again, don't start big. Start with a very small one. Start with something that comes up. But most people have probably experienced that things have happened in their past and they're beating themselves up over it, and it has nothing to do. There's nothing that they could have done. They were walking down the street and someone robbed them. You could argue they shouldn't have been on that street, but if there's nothing else that they could have done, but yet they're beating themselves up. So you got to forgive that part of it. And then maybe boundaries. A boundary would be that you only carry so much money, or that you only go out in the daytime, or that whatever. I'm not suggesting that, but or that you get a car and you're not using public transportation. Whatever that boundary is, there's things that you can do, but you have to forgive yourself in order to be able to see that next step. And then forgiving other people. This is why I'm saying you want to start small. Start with something that's small. And that same example, you have to, in that example, you may have to forgive the person who robbed you. And that doesn't feel good. This is why we go through the habit thing first, so you're not reacting. Because for some people, as soon as I bring up the idea of forgiving somebody who really hurt them, you can see them react. It's almost like a phobia response. They react and they're already off and running. So in a coaching session, I leave that alone. We change the subject, something else. I come back at it a different way. You want to prime them for having this conversation, because you don't want to bring that up raw and have them get triggered. Once they're triggered, you have to change. In my view, you change the subject. You don't keep moving on. And then, so those are the 4 pillars. And if you think about it like a table, 4 legs of a table. Once you have those 4 legs in place, you're then able to build something on top of that table. So let's say we have a tabletop. And you've got your 4 legs. Not the best draw, obviously, but you got your 4 legs. You now have, if you look at it from the side, you can now have something on which you can build your life design, right? But if you have a table that's just balancing on one leg, and you get this leg large enough that can happen, you can't hold up your whole life design. And even if you could balance it, little shocks can cause problems. And the same thing with 2 legs and 3 legs and 4 legs. So the idea is having a 4 pillars as your foundation for your life design. And let's see here. And here's the 4 pillars. So you have knowledge, habit, mastery, state mastery, and forgiveness. And you can see this is just a summary, a repeat of the previous slides. But you want to have all 4 of these. And we start here with knowledge. But to know and not do is to not know, or like not knowing. And it takes more than knowledge. We have to have agency. This is where agency happens, where you have habit mastery. Now you know that you have agency. And then state mastery is so that you have agency no matter what's going on around you. And then we have the final one, forgiveness, because this is the one that's going to keep people from going off the deep end when it's over something that happened in the past. So that's it. That gets back to the first 2 bullets, self-awareness, or the first 2 pillars of emotional intelligence, self-awareness and self-management. We'll talk more about that this week. We'll go into it in a little bit more detail and start talking about the levers that we have in each of those pillars, the 4 pillars: knowledge, habit mastery, state mastery, and forgiveness. We'll talk about those because that's what makes up that's what gives you the ability to actually execute on emotional intelligence, and is foundational to dynamic leadership. I see we have a few people out there. I will tell you that if you want to join in, we can do that with the link. I just now put the link in the chat. or the comments. You can see it in the comments. So just join in. I'll see it come in, and then I'll invite you on stage, and we just have a conversation about it. Or you could ask questions in the comments, and I will respond to them if I see them come through. I'm on different platforms, so it's possible that your comment may not come through. But if you click that, if you use that link, I'll see you come on. I'll see your the announcement come up. All right, so tomorrow I'll recap this again. I want to add some more graphics, and we'll go from there. That I'll stay on these 4 pillars this whole week, and then move into more taking action on it. The January, my live events every day, 8 a.m., they're all about self-mastery. So it's all going to be related. And then in February, it's applying it to other people. So once we get ourselves to a place where we're comfortable, we apply it with other people. All right, there you go. See you tomorrow.